Hey guys, welcome to your first lecture of Bio 202. We are starting out with the endocrine system. So let's get to it. I'm at home, I'm in my house, and you will hear my birds chirping in the background, and hopefully one of my dogs will stay calm and collective and they won't bark at any point in time. But if you do, I apologize in advance. All right, I'm gonna move this, y'all. Over here. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start off with an overview of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is made up of a series of glands that are actually going to be distributed through the entire body. And when we first mentioned glands, when we talked about the tissues that we learned about in 201, and if you didn't take 201, it's no problem. You know, we just talked about tissues in 201. You can learn about that in the fall. We learned that there are actually two types of glands that we find in the body. There are exocrine glands and there are endocrine glands. Now, exocrine glands that start with the EX are going to be glands that are distributed throughout the body that are going to produce what we call non-hormonal substances. So a non-hormonal substance is going to be like saliva or sweat is another great example. And these non-hormonal substances are going to leave the exocrine gland and arrive at their final destination, shall we say, through a duct, D-U-C-T, duct, that is connected to them. So for instance, our salivary glands are exocrine glands, and saliva is produced inside of those exocrine glands. It leaves the gland, enters into a duct, and that duct is going to end in your oral cavity or in your mouth, and that's how saliva fills your mouth when you eat. Also, an example of an exocrine gland is a sweat gland. So we have sweat glands all over our skin, and when those exocrine glands produce sweat, which is a non-hormonal substance, that sweat is going to travel up through a duct and be distributed through our pores on the surface of our skin. So exocrine EX means that the gland is going to produce a non-hormonal substance. And it means also that that gland is going to have a duct attached to it, and the non-hormonal substance that is going to be produced is going to go directly from point A inside the exocrine gland to point B, normally the surface of something. Now, exocrine glands, as necessary as they are in the body, are not part of the endocrine system. And there's my cuckoo clock, sorry, endocrine system. The endocrine system is made up of endocrine glands, E-N-D, endocrine glands. So endocrine glands are different because of two things. The first is that they are going to actually produce a substance which is called a hormone. And a hormone is a type of chemical signal that is has the capability of bringing about change somewhere in the body. And we'll talk more about hormones in a little bit in this lecture. So the endocrine glands are going to produce hormones, and these hormones are going to be secreted from the endocrine glands, and they're going to fill the interstitial fluid or the area around the cells that are in these endocrine glands. And from this interstitial fluid, they are going to move into the circulatory system or into the blood vessels, and they travel throughout the entire body through these blood vessels. Now, because of this, endocrine glands can be located in one part of the body and produce a hormone that has the capacity to travel throughout the entire body. And this is important because a lot of hormones are produced, let's say, for example, there are hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland, which is in our brain, and they are picked up by the circulatory system, and they are actually going to have an effect in our adrenal glands, which are way down here. You can even see adrenal glands that lay on top of our kidneys. And they're able to do so because they travel throughout the entire body in the circulatory system. All right, so two different types of glands. We have exocrine, EX, and endocrine. And the differences between the two, between exocrine or endocrine, also are twofold. Exocrine glands have non-hormonal substances, and they have ducts through which the non-hormonal substance is going to be delivered. And endocrines are going to produce hormones, and they are ductless, and they are going to deliver their hormones through the use of the circulatory system. Now, we will talk a lot more about exocrine glands when we talk about the digestive system, because most of the glands that are responsible for producing enzymes, hydrochloric acid for digestion are going to be exocrine glands. So we will talk about those, but not in this chapter. This chapter is going to focus on endocrine glands, ones that produce hormones. A quick overview of the endocrine system. It's made up of a series of glands that are distributed throughout the body. They're not in close proximity to each other, but they don't need to be, because they are going to produce these hormones that are going to be picked up in the bloodstream and move throughout the entire body. So there's no need for them to all of these glands to be grouped together, and there's no need for all of these glands to be located directly next to what is going to be referred to as the target organ for that particular hormone. So what we have here is, the ones that we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus, which is not labeled here, but the hypothalamus is right here. The pituitary gland, which is right here, it's very small. It's about the size of like a green pea, and it is actually attached to the hypothalamus. We have the thyroid, and the thyroid is right here. It's going to be right here in our neck. It actually looks a little bit like a bow tie. The thyroid is right here. Next, we have the pancreas. Now, the pancreas is right here. Now, normally our stomach would be right here, and the pancreas kind of wraps behind the stomach. Pancreas is a very important, well, all of them are important, but is one you may have heard about, because the pancreas is going to be involved with producing two hormones that are going to be very important in regulation of blood glucose levels. So if you have anyone in your family or know anyone who has diabetes, they have issues with the hormones that are produced in the pancreas. The next is the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands, there's two of them, and they are going to sit on top of these little structures here, which are our kidneys. And lastly, we're going to talk about the endocrine function of the reproductive organs. And in females, that's going to be the ovaries. We have two, one here and one here. And males, that's going to be the testicles, the testes, one and two, shall I say. So there are two ways that your body is going to be able to stay within this very comfortable range that we call homeostasis. So homeostasis is a state in which the body is at this very even keel. Your body temperature is, quote unquote, normally 98.6, although most people now, their temperature is a little bit higher. It's more in the 99 range than I would say 98.6. But there's a very small range that our temperature is considered normal. So if our temperature is lower than that average 98.6 or higher than our average 98.6, you would say that we're in a state of homeostatic or homeostasis imbalance. Now, how's the body going to bring it back into this nice even keel, this regular body temperature? Well, there are two ways in which the body can do this. It's through the nervous system and also through the endocrine system. And this has to deal not just with body temperature. We can go back to what I was talking about with the pancreas and diabetes. Your blood glucose level is supposed to be a certain level, and there are hormones that if it gets out of that certain level is going to cause it to rise, or it will cause it to lower. So if you think about it as like a seesaw kind of situation, and this is not good because I'm wearing all black as usual. So let's talk about it as a seesaw sort of situation. So our body likes to be, you know, this nice even keel. So if our blood glucose level would start to rise, we're going to have an imbalance. Well, we have a hormone that will push that right back down so that our blood glucose level is at a normal, our normal rate or stage, shall we say. Now, if our blood glucose level starts to drop, well, there's another hormone that's going to push it back up and bring it back to that even state of homeostasis. Now, there are two systems that are going to work in conjunction with each other to bring and keep our bodies in this even homeostasis keel. And they are the nervous system and the endocrine system. And the difference between the two systems really lies in three factors: how quickly it works, how long it works, and how it works. So the nervous system is going to be very quick in responding, very, very quick. However, it is not going to be able to sustain that response for a very long time. So we say that the nervous system response to any kind of homeostatic imbalance is going to be very quick, but very short. And it is going to bring about change through nerve impulses or action potentials and neurotransmitters. For those of you who are not familiar with those terms, action potential and neurotransmitters, action potential is a fancy name for the electrical impulses that we see traveling down nerve cells. And neurotransmitters are a type of chemical that is going to be used to transmit messages from nerve cell to nerve cell. And because nerve cells are going to be responsible for this quick but short-lived response, we say that the nervous system is going to have a direct stimulation, actual contact, you know, nerve cell to, you know, target interaction. They're actually going to make contact with each other. And I like to think of the nervous system kind of like the ambulance, okay, an ambulance. So if there is some sort of problem, some sort of car accident, who shows up fast? The ambulance shows up fast. And the medics are going to, or the paramedics that are in that ambulance are going to be able to respond very, very quickly. And they are going to do a really good job, but their contact with the individual that they're working on is short-lived. How short? Well, it's normally at the scene and to the ride to the hospital. All right, so they're quick response, but very short-lived response. Because once that ambulance gets to the hospital, the longer acting regulator is going to take over. And in this case, that longer acting, longer lasting, shall I say, player is going to be the endocrine system. All right, so our body's out of homeostasis. Immediately our nervous system is going to kick into action. It's going to help bring us back to where we should be, but that response is going to be very short-lived. It's long enough normally for our second system, the endocrine system, to start to take over. Now the endocrine system, the response is going to be slower, but the response is long lasting. It can keep us at that even keel for a much longer period of time. Now there's several reasons why the response is a little bit slower. One of them is that the endocrine system or the endocrine glands are going to produce hormones. Hormones need to be produced, then they need to be secreted from the cells, then they need to be taken up in the bloodstream, then they need to travel through the bloodstream to get to the target, and then eventually set a change in motion. And sometimes even the hormones need to be built up to a certain level before an actual change can be seen in the body. However, once they get up to a certain hormone levels, get up to a certain state or a certain level, they're going to be sustained for a long period of time in the blood. So, endocrine system response is going to be typically slower, but it's going to be much longer lasting. Unlike the nervous system, it doesn't work by action potentials. It's going to work by the production of these hormones that we talked about. We're getting to talk about these hormones that are going to move through the circulatory system. And we we refer to this as an indirect stimulation, because unlike the nervous system where you have nerve actually coming in contact with the target, in the endocrine system, we have a gland here producing a hormone that travels through the circulatory system, and then it's that hormone that actually is going to bring about change to that target organ. So it's more indirect. All right, so two different systems that are going to work to bring our bodies back into homeostasis. Nervous system is going to act first. It's fastest, short-lived response. It's going to bring about a response through action potentials and neurotransmitters. The second is the endocrine system. It kicks in second. It's typically slower, but longer lasting. It's going to bring about those changes through hormones. Again, you can think of it as the nervous system as the ambulance that is going to be the immediate at the scene of the event, the paramedics that are going to provide the help on the way to the hospital, and you can think of the doctors in the emergency room, nurses in the emergency room being the endocrine system, where they take over and they continue the work, but they are going to be more longer lasting effects with the patient. So we keep talking about these hormones. So what are these hormones, and what are they made of? We know that there's a difference between a hormone and a non-hormonal substance. We talked about that when we talked about exocrine and endocrine glands, but what are hormones? So hormones are chemicals that are going to be produced in endocrine glands and that are going to be able to bring about changes in what are referred to as target organs or target cells. And when we categorize hormones, we can categorize them based on their structures. And there are two classes of hormones based on their structures. The first one is lipid-soluble hormones. And lipid-soluble hormones are going to be dissolvable, or have the ability to dissolve in lipids or fats. And then there are water-soluble hormones, and these are going to have the ability to dissolve in water. Well, one thing we know about water and fats is water and fats don't mix. If you have some butter, or you have some oil, or you have some lard, and you throw it in a glass of water, the two are going to remain separate. The butter is going to remain all together, and the water is going to surround it. Same way with lard. Even if you were to melt the butter or melt the lard and you would pour it in there, and you shake it up as much as you want, eventually what's going to happen is that the top layer is going to be the lard or the fat, and the bottom layer is going to be the water, because fats and water just do not mix. So what we already know because of that, and we can relate it to the structure of these hormones, we're going to know that the lipid-soluble are going to be able to dissolve in fats, but not in water. And the water-soluble are going to be able to be soluble in water, but not fats. And this is going to be very important, because what are cell membranes made of? Cell membranes are made up of the phospholipid bilayer, and there's the key word there, phospholipid bilayer. So the plasma membranes, or the outer coverings of all of our cells, is made up of a fat. So the lipid-soluble is going to be able to move through that layer of fat and into the cell, while the water-soluble is not going to be able to. And this is a huge difference between the two, because they're going to have to bring about changes in cells differently, basically because the lipid-soluble can get into the cell and the water-soluble cannot. So the lipid-soluble hormones are referred to as steroid hormones because they are, a major component of them are made up of steroids, and steroids are a type of lipid we talked about in Bio 103. Steroids are lipids that have a ring-like shape, a characteristic 5-carbon ring. The two steroids that are at work at making hormones in humans are cholesterol and eicosanoids. I am horrible at pronunciation. I apologize that the word that I am slaughtering up there is right here. Eicosanoids. Both of these are fat structure. They have fatty acid chains. Cholesterol you've probably heard of before, probably in terms of being bad for you. Yes, if you have too much cholesterol in your blood, too much cholesterol in your body, it can be bad for you, but you do need cholesterol to live. Cholesterol is needed. There's actually cholesterol that's embedded in every single one of your plasma membranes of your cells, and cholesterol is going to be the precursor for a lot of hormones. Some of the steroid-based hormones are testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. So if you don't have cholesterol, then you're going to have a lot of problems because there are a lot of steroid-based hormones that cholesterol is a component of them. Our water-soluble hormones are going to be composed mostly of proteins or components of proteins. So peptides such as amino acids, short peptides, which are very short chains of amino acids linked together, and also long proteins, which are longer chains of amino acids that are going to be linked together. Water-soluble also can be constructed of monoamines, and monoamines are aromatic amino acids, which is a fancy term for amino acids that have a ring structure in them. Some of these actually you may have heard of, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan. You've probably heard of tryptophan every November because turkey has a lot of tryptophan in it, and everyone is like, oh, tryptophan, it's what makes you go to sleep, you know, turkey makes you sleepy. Actually, it's not really the turkey that makes you sleepy, it's all the carbohydrates you eat normally at a Thanksgiving dinner, but tryptophan always gets the bad press here. Phenylalanine, you may have seen that word before, heard that word before. If you look on the back of any kind of diet soda or any kind of artificial sweetener, they normally have phenylalanine in it, and they will contain warning labels because there are a very small part of the population that are not able to break down phenylalanine, and if they ingest too much of it, it can actually cause a lot of problems for them. Take home, two different types of hormones, lipid-soluble and water-soluble. Lipid-soluble are going to be able to pass through the plasma membrane and get into the cell. They are structurally made up of a precursor steroid. Water-soluble are not going to be able to pass through the plasma membrane because plasma membrane is made up of lipids, and mostly they have a precursor of some sort of protein or amino acid. Let's talk about the lipid-soluble hormones. So as I said, the lipid-soluble hormones, which in this picture over here, this is an example of that lipid-soluble hormone. It's just labeled steroid hormone. Well, because, you know, it's a steroid precursor, which makes up the lipid-soluble hormones. So the lipid-soluble hormones, as I promised, have the capacity of moving through the plasma membrane. This line here is designates the phospholipid bilayer. It's able to move through this phospholipid bilayer because lipid-soluble hormones can dissolve right through that lipid plasma membrane. Now, once inside the cell, the lipid-soluble hormone is going to bind to a receptor protein. And in this image here, we have the steroid receptor or the lipid-soluble hormone receptor. We see that the lipid-soluble hormone is going to bind to that lipid-soluble hormone receptor. Now, we're going to find out in, I think, about like 1 or 2 slides, that this receptor can be located either in the cytoplasm or it can be located in the nucleus. All right, let's not worry about that right now. Let's just understand that the steroid, the lipid-soluble hormone, once it moves into the cell, prior to doing anything else, it's going to bind to a receptor protein. Now, the hormone bound to the receptor is then going to bind to the chromatin or the DNA that is inside the nucleus. And you'll notice here that I have written ligand-bound receptor. The word ligand is a very general term for something that binds. So for instance, yes, this is a lipid-soluble protein. Yes, this is the receptor protein to which the lipid-soluble hormone is going to bind. And in this case, this would generally be referred to as a ligand. Why? Because that ligand binds to a receptor, okay? So together, this lipid-soluble hormone and the receptor protein is referred to as the ligand-bound receptor, okay? The ligand-bound receptor, in this case, since it was located in the cytoplasm, is going to move through the nuclear membrane, again, another phospholipid bilayer, into the nucleus, and it is going to bind to the chromatin. And remember, the chromatin is the highly condensed form of the DNA. Oh, no, it's not. I lied to you. The chromatin is the diffused form of the DNA. It's going to bind to that chromatin, and it's going to trigger the transcription of a particular gene into mRNA. What does transcription mean? Transcription basically means that a little section of the DNA that is called a gene is going to be used to make a copy of mRNA. mRNA stands for messenger RNA. Now that messenger RNA is going to leave the nucleus, move into the cytoplasm, become attached to a ribosome, and that mRNA is going to then become it's going to undergo translation. And when it's translated, that mRNA is going to be used as a template to produce a new protein. So in essence, this steroid hormone or this lipid-soluble hormone that has entered into this particular cell has triggered the production of some sort of protein inside of that particular cell. Now, we don't know what protein it's going to be. This is just an overview, a generic, cell that we're using to explain how these lipid-soluble hormones work. But maybe that protein is going to cause the kidneys to retain more water. Or maybe this protein is going to cause cells inside of the bones to break down bone matter and release calcium into the bloodstream. So numerous things that these proteins could possibly do. But regardless of what they do wind up doing, it was this hormone that started this whole entire, the hormone entering into the cell that started this whole entire cascade of events. Now, when a lipid-soluble hormone binds to the chromatin in the nucleus of a cell, it is referred to as direct gene activation. Why direct gene activation? Because it directly binds to a particular gene in the chromatin or in the DNA inside the cell. And this can only happen with a lipid-soluble hormone, because only a lipid-soluble hormone is going to be able to get into the cell in the first place. Now, when it binds to the receptor protein, the receptor proteins in this case have a special name. The receptor proteins are referred to as nuclear receptors. Nuclear receptors because they are going to be able to directly influence gene expression. And gene expression means which gene or what section on the DNA is going to be able to produce a particular strand of mRNA, and whatever strand of mRNA is produced is going to be whatever type of protein is going to be produced. So there are two types of nuclear receptors. There's type 1 nuclear receptor and type 2 nuclear receptor. And wow, they really went out on a limb naming these guys, didn't they? Okay. So let's look to see what the type 1 nuclear receptor is going to do. So when I was talking about the lipid-soluble hormone entering into the cell, I said that the receptor that it's going to bind to can either be found in the cytoplasm or it can be found in the nucleus. Well, the receptor that is going to be found in the cytoplasm is called a type 1 nuclear receptor. So here we have an example of a type 1 nuclear receptor. It is located inside of the cytoplasm. So this is the plasma membrane here, the outer membrane. This is the nuclear membrane, or the membrane that is going to be around the nucleus. And here we have the DNA that is inside of the nucleus. So here we have our lipid-soluble protein. It enters into the cytoplasm, and then it is carried and bound to a type 1 nuclear receptor found in the cytoplasm. Once the lipid-soluble hormone binds to the type 1 nuclear receptor, that type 1 nuclear receptor is going to move into the nucleus, where it will bind to a specific region of the DNA, and it will prompt the transcription of the DNA into mRNA. An mRNA strand will be produced. It will move back out into the cytoplasm, and in the cytoplasm it'll attach to a ribosome, and then that mRNA will be translated into a protein, and that protein then will bring about a change in some sort of cell function. All right, so that's a type 1 nuclear receptor. So if a type 1 nuclear receptor is found in the cytosol, where do you think the type 2 nuclear receptor is going to be found? Well, you probably guessed it already, but a type 2 nuclear receptor is going to be found directly inside of the nucleus. So here we have, I don't like this. This is the only picture that I could find that was good, but what I don't like about this picture is that it doesn't have a plasma membrane. So this is the plasma membrane. This here is just the nucleus. So if we go back here we have just the nucleus. So in this picture, this is just the nucleus. So this is the nuclear membrane. So all this area, this white area out here, is part of the cytoplasm. Okay, so in a type 2 nuclear receptor, the hormone is going, the lipid-soluble hormone is going to enter into the cytoplasm. And then it's going to continue on, and it's going to enter into the actual nucleus itself. Once inside the nucleus, it is going to bind to the type 2 nuclear receptor, the receptor that is going to bind the lipid-soluble hormone and found inside the nucleus itself. Now, the interesting thing about the type 2 nuclear receptor is that often on the type 2 nuclear receptor, prior to the hormone binding it, it is bound to something that is called a co-repressor. So the co-repressor is a type of protein that actually is going to prevent the type 2 nuclear receptor from binding to the DNA if a lipid-soluble hormone is not present. Now, once the lipid-soluble hormone is present and it binds to the type 2 nuclear receptor, the co-repressor protein is going to be released. And once the co-repressor protein is released, we're going to see that the lipid-soluble hormone type 2 nuclear receptor is going to be free to bind the specific gene region in the chromatin, allow for the transcription of that gene and the formation of mRNA. And then the same thing's going to happen. mRNA is going to leave and move into the cytoplasm. It's going to attach to a ribosome, and it's going to undergo translation and produce a protein. And then that protein is going to bring about some sort of change within the cell itself. All right, so that is what happens with lipid-soluble proteins. So now let's talk about what is going to happen with water-soluble, not lipid-soluble proteins, lipid-soluble hormones, sorry. So now let's talk about what's going to happen with water-soluble hormones. Now, water-soluble hormones are going to have to do something a lot different because water-soluble is not going to get through the phospholipid bilayer. Water is not going to be able to pass through that fat layer that makes up the plasma membrane. So water-soluble hormones are going to have to do some sort of kind of workaround to get its message into the cell itself. And so what we see is that these water-soluble hormones are actually going to bind to cell surface receptor proteins. So here we have our phospholipid bilayer, 2 layers of the phospholipid, and within that phospholipid bilayer that makes up the plasma membrane, we have this cell surface receptor protein that has this receptor that is extended on the exterior of the cell. So what happens is that the hormone, again, it's labeled here ligand because a ligand is going to bind a receptor. That hormone is going to bind the cell surface receptor on this receptor protein. And when that hormone binds this cell surface receptor, a message is going to be transmitted into the interior of the cell, and a secondary messenger is going to wind up bringing about change within the interior of the cell. So you probably might be saying, well, if that's a secondary messenger, what was the first messenger? Well, the first messenger is the hormone. The hormone brings the initial message, the hormone binds to the receptor, and then this receptor's job is to basically go ahead and pass that message on to the secondary messenger, which is going to do the work on the inside of the cell. First messenger, hormone on the outside, receptor, it's a cell surface receptor is going to transmit that message to the secondary messenger that is going to transmit that message inside the cell. So this is a way that the water-soluble hormones get away with not being able to move through the plasma membrane itself. It's not going to, it itself is not physically going to move through the plasma membrane, but at least its message is going to get through the plasma membrane. So let's talk a little bit more in depth on how that is going to happen. So here we have the setup of what is referred to as a secondary or second messenger system, all right? Second messenger system because that first message is on the outside, the second messenger is on the inside. All right, so we have our phospholipid bilayer, our outside of our cell, our inside of our cell. We have our major players that we're going to talk about. We have our first messenger, which is going to be our hormone. We have our membrane or cell surface receptor. We have another player, the G protein, which is inside the cell. We have an effector, which is going to be bound within the plasma membrane. And then we also have the second messenger that is on the inside. This is quite kind of a complicated situation that is going on. And this is one of the reasons why I like biology so much, is because things can get quite complicated to just do very simple things that take microseconds and that we take, you know, complete, you know, granted of. Things like our blood sugar being proper, or our fight or flight mechanisms that allow us to prepare for some kind of stressor. All of this happens automatically and within microseconds. And all of these players have to line up exactly perfectly in order for them to happen. And it's just really kind of amazing to me that all of this happens so quickly and so perfectly every single time. When you think about it, you know, just so much going on. I don't understand how we all just don't like malfunction constantly. So let's go through the secondary messenger system. All right. So the first thing is that that first messenger, that hormone, is going to bind to our good old cell surface receptor. Now, when that hormone binds to the cell surface receptor, the cell surface receptor is going to have a change in its shape. And when it changes shape, a portion of the receptor that is on the inside of the cell is going to reveal a G protein binding site. And that G protein binding site is going to bind to the G protein, and when it binds to the G protein, we're going to see that the G protein is going to become activated. Now, once the G protein is activated, it is actually literally going to move along the interior portion of the plasma membrane and come in contact with the effector and activate the effector. Then the effector is going to activate the secondary messenger, and then that secondary messenger is going to go about a even longer cascade of events that eventually brings about a change inside of the cell. All right. I know you probably have to put on pause because I did say that really, really quick, but I'm going to flip to the next one because I have them written in order and I'm going to review them again. So you might have to rewind a bit, but let's look at this one. All right, so here we have the players, all of them in the order of the sequence. So we're going to have our hormone work first, our first messenger, then our cell surface receptor, then our G protein, then our effector, then our secondary messenger, and then we're going to have some sort of cellular process change. Okay, so let's work through here. Our first player is our hormone. Our hormone is going to bind to our cell surface receptor. Our cell surface receptor, when the hormone binds, is going to change shape, and it's going to reveal a G protein binding site on the portion that is on the interior of the cell. The G protein is then going to bind to that binding site, and the G protein is going to become activated. The G protein then moves along the interior of the plasma membrane, comes in contact with the effector, which is going to be located inside the, or, you know, suspended within the phospholipid bilayer, the plasma membrane. The effector is then going to become activated, and then the effector is going to activate the secondary messenger inside of the cell. Then the secondary messenger is going to bring about the change inside of the cell. A lot more complicated than the lipid-soluble hormone that can just move in and do all the work itself. The water-soluble protein has to rely on, you know, the cell surface receptor, the G protein, the effector, and the secondary messenger in order to get its message from the outside of the cell to the interior of the cell. Again, a lot going on very, very quickly, all in perfect harmony to allow us to do simple things like digest food. Now, hormones, as I said, are going to be transported in the blood. And what is going to happen is that the particular endocrine cell is going to Hold on a second. My husband's come in the door and I have to let him in. Everyone, welcome my husband. Welcome, husband. Okay, so hormones are going to be produced by endocrine cells. My class, my husband, my class. They're going to be produced by endocrine cells. Those endocrine cells are going to secrete their hormones out into this interstitial tissue, interstitial fluid, and then they are going to move into the circulatory system and travel through the circulatory system until they reach their target sites. And their target cells are going to have specific receptors for them, either on the surface of the cell in the case of water-soluble hormones, or inside the cell in the case of lipid-soluble hormones. So when we talk about hormones, they're going to be transported through the body through the systematic circulation. And this is what's going to happen typically. And this is why the glands that make up the endocrine system can be dispersed throughout the entire body. They don't need to be grouped together, and they don't need to be near what organ they are going to target, because whatever is produced up here in the pituitary gland is going to be picked up in the circulatory system, and it's going to go throughout the entire body. Now, there is a case where there are these special kind of direct, let's say, routes that we find in the circulatory system called portal system. Okay, so this is an image of the pituitary gland. I know you guys probably say, oh, those are testicles. No, they're not. It's the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is found in the brain. It's made up of two parts, the anterior pituitary gland, the posterior pituitary gland, and it is connected directly to the hypothalamus, which is another portion of the brain. So the thing about the hypothalamus is that it itself produces a large amount of hormones that actually control what hormones the pituitary gland is going to produce. And so there is a vascular connection that is going to be found connecting the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And what we see is this is referred to as a portal system, because whatever enters the bloodstream here is going to go directly here. Now, we have several different portal systems in the body. One of the ones that we'll talk about is called the hepatic portal system, and that's actually found in your liver, and it has a great deal to do with the detoxification of things that our digestive system takes up. What I want you to remember at this point in time is that, yes, there are a majority of the hormones that we're going to talk about are going to be produced by a particular gland, picked up by the circulatory system, and travel very long distances in order to bring about change. However, there are some hormones, particularly in this case, that are going to be produced in the hypothalamus, that are going to be picked up and directly delivered via a portal system to the pituitary gland. Now, this is together the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is a very short distance. It's probably about, I'm trying to think, it's probably about 3, maybe 4 centimeters in the length. There's 2.5 centimeters in an inch, so that is, maybe an inch and a half. That's probably being very generous, actually. So a portal system is going to be a direct route, but it's very short distance, where the systematic circulatory system is going to carry those hormones very long distances. So when these hormones circulate, whether in the portal system or in the systemic circulation, A majority of them are going to circulate bound to transport proteins. Now, transport proteins are going to do two things. The first thing is that they're going to hold the hormones in an inactive state as they travel through the systemic circulation. Only when they enter into their target cell, which is located in their target organ, are they going to become activated or be in an activated form. The other thing that transport proteins are going to do is that they're going to create a reservoir that's going to facilitate an even distribution of hormones throughout the entire target tissue or target organ. So let's say we have our target organ and we have our blood supply to it. Well, if our hormones are traveling in our circulatory system, there would be, a possibility of the hormones just activating the top portion of this particular organ, because they enter into the organ via the circulatory system and bam, attached to those target cells that are located, the first ones they see. Well, what these transport proteins do is that they ensure that not only the first contact of that organ has with that systemic circulation, that is activated, but there's a full activation of the entire organ. Now, not all hormones travel in circulation attached to a transport protein, but an overwhelming majority of them do. Now, one last thing I want to talk about in this lecture, before we actually get into talking about specific endocrine organs or endocrine glands and specific hormones, is this word target cell that I keep saying. So target cell or target organ. So a target cell are going to be cells that are receptive to a specific secreted hormone. So if we have a product, a hormone that is produced in the brain, and it needs to bring about changes in the kidneys, well, there has to be some sort of, sign or signal in those specific kidney cells that is going to attract that hormone as it travels through the circulation. And it does, it has specific receptors either inside the cell, if it's a lipid-soluble hormone, or on the surface of the cell if it's a water-soluble hormone. And these specific receptors are going to be a signal for each specific hormone to leave circulation and move into that particular organ. So target cells are going to be these cells that are receptive to secreted hormones, and each hormone is going to have its specific target cells. The target cell activation, whether or not a particular target cell is activated, is going to depend on three different factors. The first is going to be the hormone level in the blood. The higher the hormone level in the blood, the greater chance a particular target cell has to be activated. Think about it. If you have a target cell here and you have 20 hormones floating by, versus the target cell and you have 200 hormones floating by. Well, of course, when there is more hormones in the circulation, there's a greater chance of that particular cell getting activated. The second is the receptor levels on the target, and this shouldn't say L's, it should say cells. Receptor levels on the target cells. So does the target cell have one receptor on the surface or one receptor in the cytoplasm? Or does the target cell have 100 receptors on the outside, on the surface of the cell, or 100 receptors in the cytoplasm? Of course, the more receptors there are, the greater chance the hormone has to attaching to that cell. And lastly is the hormone receptor affinity. Once the hormone attaches to that receptor, either inside or on the surface of the cell, how long does that hormone stay attached to that receptor? Now, of these three things, there's two things that can be kind of fiddled with and one that can't. All right, so there's no way that your body can adjust the particular hormone receptor affinity. It is what it is. But our bodies can adjust the other two. They can increase the levels of hormone in the blood, or they can decrease the levels of hormone in the blood by increasing secretion from a particular endocrine gland or decreasing the secretion from a particular endocrine gland. And individual cells can also increase the number of receptors that they have inside of them or on the surface, or they can actually decrease the number of receptors they have on the surface or in the cytoplasm. And by varying the numbers of the receptors that are available and varying the concentration or the hormone levels in the blood, the body can regulate the activation or the strength of, or the number of target cells that are going to be activated. All right, we're going to stop here and we will start up on our next lecture about the onset, duration, and half-life of hormone activity.